Tēnā koutou katoa. Tonight we are fortunate to have Anna Elders with us. Anna is a mental health nurse practitioner and also a trained cognitive behavioural therapist with almost 20 years clinical experience working with people across the lifespan. Anna is the clinical lead for a new online CBD tool, Just a Thought, and works in clinical practice as a nurse practitioner with Tamaki Health. Tonight's webinar is titled Supporting Mental Wellbeing by Identifying and Working with Chronic Stress, including common causes, impacts, and effective approaches to unwinding chronic stress. Sounds very interesting and relevant in this climate. I will now hand you over to Anna. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Firstly, thank you very much for joining. It's a bit of a strange time to be sitting and listening to someone talk about stress, though probably you're all at the end of a very long day, so it's probably quite appropriate, I'd imagine. So I hope you've got some snacks and supplies and you can sit back and enjoy the next hour. So thanks, Kathy, for introducing me. So my background, as Kathy said, I trained as a nurse. I worked in different areas before I went over to the UK and trained as a cognitive behavioural therapist. So that's what I've largely done for the last 15 years and have gotten very passionate about CBT and done a lot of teaching at the University of Auckland and around the country and looking at trauma-informed care and different aspects of psychological wellbeing, and decided to jump in a bit deeper in terms of what I could offer and became a nurse practitioner. And more recently got into integrative medicine. So I'm just beginning my I suppose, my studies in that area. So my talk is going to be long and broad, which I hope is going to be helpful in looking at the topic of stress. Just another little plug, I'm also the clinical lead for a brand new free CBT tool, Just a Thought, which is available now. So jump on that and have a look. But without further ado, I will kick off. So tonight we're going to be looking at the topic of supporting mental wellbeing by identifying and working with chronic stress, which I think you'll all agree is quite a hot topic at the moment with what we're going through globally. So just a bit of an overview of the presentation. So we're going to be having a look at some of the common causes and the perpetuating factors of chronic stress, having a look at the way that chronic stress impacts us in terms of both our mental and our physical well-being, and having a look at some of the effects that nutritional, cognitive, and behavioural adaptive responses have on chronic stress, and explore the effective approaches that we can use ourselves and we can use with people that we support in our practices to help them to unwind from chronic stress and try to protect their well-being and enhance their resilience. So like I said, we're going to go pretty broad and long. Some things I'm going to go into more in-depth discussion about, other things I'm going to fly over. Apologies for any of the teaching you the psychiatric parts, but it's all valuable to recap and recover. And if there's anything that you want me to perhaps discuss in a bit more in-depth way, then please feel free to jump on and ask a question. So, firstly, I just want us to think a little bit about what are some of the factors that are crucial in general in terms of our well-being. So we're looking wide here, just at our general well-being. So we know that one of the big things is, of course, our genetics. So what we have inherently in our vulnerabilities in terms of our family histories and some of those genes that might be sitting there, either already turned on or waiting to turn on in the future. Our diet is a massive one in terms of what I like to say to patients, what we put in our face. What we're eating and what we're not eating, and environmental stresses, so what's happening around us in our homes, in our communities, in our environments, our lifestyle behaviours, the good and the bad and the ugly. So we're obviously talking about things like exercise or substance use, smoking, what's happening in our bodies. So some of the patterns that are already set in, if we look at our sort of neuroendocrine system, so the way our central nervous system appears to be working, how our hormones are functioning in our body, and that whole interplay, with the way that our central nervous system and our endocrine system work. A massive one is our childhood experiences and our experiences over time as well, what we've been through, where we've been and what we've experienced, and stress, which we're obviously going to be looking at today. So these are all important factors to hold in mind as we sort of move through, and funnily enough, they're all going to be covered off in one way or another over this talk. So let's just start off by having a think about what is stress, and these are probably great topic to debate. But if we think about it, what some interesting information I found out when I was actually researching this was that the word was first used in physics to sort of discuss the interaction between a force and a resistance to counter that force. So when they started talking about the idea of elasticity, they looked at obviously the properties of material and the force that was required to create a strain and a change in the shape of that material. So there was an endocrinologist that came out of Hungary and lived actually in Canada back in the 30s, who first coined the phrase stress in around 1936. So he looked at the universal patient reactions to illness and defined stress as the non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. And he further sort of elaborated that on talking about stress as being the rate of wear and tear on the body over time in response to these stresses. So stress synonymous with distress, and certainly in my practice I always use those terms as well as things like anxiety quite interchangeably. And if we look at a dictionary definition, it's defined as a physical, mental or emotional strain or tension, or a condition or feeling experience when a person perceives that the demands exceed the personal and social resources the individual is able to mobilise. So there's something there about, if we think going back to physics, it's about that force that's being exerted and the ability for that material, or in this case perhaps a person, to be able to sustain and shift and bend to that force and mobilise to try and hold their shape, I suppose, for want of a better description. So if we have a bit of a look at this initial thoughts of stress over time, stress is often used to describe different things. Firstly, people often talk about stress in terms of it being an unpleasant situation or an event. So, so much stress, I've got to go to my in-laws' house, for example. Some people describe stress as the actual reactions to those events or those stressful events. So, I could just feel so much stress in my body, and, they might be relating to sort of palpitations or reflux or heartburn. And some people utilise the term and have utilised it over time in terms of stress to talk about the end results. The actual physical manifestations of stress, whether that might be a gastric ulcer or, a heart attack. So it's often thought about in different ways, but I liked this excerpt in a British medical journal that said a physician was quoted on stress, in addition to being itself, was also the cause of itself and the result of itself. So if we think about stress, it is definitely a bit of a continuum, and it seems to involve both what comes before, or perhaps could be considered a trigger, what results during, and what follows afterwards. So in some ways, stress becomes its own vicious cycle. And I just put this up. You can find so many interesting and really helpful vicious cycles when you look and pick apart the different impacts of stress. And this one here is around overeating. I overeat because I'm stressed, and I'm stressed because I overeat. So if we look at defining stress from a stressor, and this is just some nice basic covering over. So a stressor is considered to be like a type of a trigger, and it's described here as a chemical or biological agent, an environmental condition, an external, and I included in here, or an internal stimulus, being a CBT therapist, or an event that's seen as causing stress to an organism. And psychologically speaking, the idea of a stressor is that it's considered to be demanding, challenging, and or threatening to a sense of individual safety. And we're not necessarily talking here, obviously, about physical safety. We're also talking about social safety, which for anyone that works in mental health or does a lot of work talking to people about their stress and their anxiety, social safety is absolutely up there when we talk about stresses that people are concerned about, which makes sense if we think about survival and the fact that we are, really a pack sort of species, needing each other to get along and, of course, to procreate. So when we think a little bit about the different types of stresses that are around, we can sort of start to list them, and this isn't exhaustive, but we know that environmental surrounds can create stresses, so certain temperatures, obviously, which aren't ideal temperatures. Sound can be stressful. Anyone that has a teenager that blasts out death metal music might know about that, and apologies for any lovers of death metal listening. Lighting, for example, and overcrowding. And actually, when I was putting this down, I was just thinking around what we know around torture methods actually often use environmental stresses to cause stress and affect whatever they're attempting to affect with the people that are being tortured. Daily stress, so everything from annoyances like having to sit in traffic and coming from Auckland, out in South Auckland, whenever I have to travel into the city, I know all about that one. Losing your keys, financial stresses, life changes, so we're talking about big significant shifts, so divorce, bereavement. What's not in here and should be is, of course, having children, one of the biggest stresses that I think any of us ever suffer. And workplace. So lots of different types of workplace stresses. Even in the best of workplaces, obviously, there are things that get stressful, deadlines that show up. People are often very stressful in workplaces. And of course, there are certain types of issues that can come up in workplaces that become even more stressful, bullying, all sorts of things. Chemical stresses, so we think about here largely what we put in our bodies, but of course some of those chemical stresses sit in the environment as well, so and obviously relate to sort of lifestyle choices. Social and relational stresses, so harking back to maybe our in-laws here, or our neighbours from hell, or whatever might be going on, those and not just conflict, but societal and family demands. So of course it doesn't have to be stress, but anyone here that's juggling work and life, or is part of the sandwich generation with parents they're looking after as well as kids, or whatever it might be, will know all about that. Lifestyle, so these are, challenges maybe with deficits that are there, like things like exercise, or perhaps even challenges with not having achievement and pleasure well balanced, and so not having enough time for self-care and relaxing. And then I've popped this one in internal, or what I call cognitive stresses. So cognitions are really anything that rents space in your mind. So there might be memories, images, thoughts. So some examples of these would be someone that has a lot of self-criticism or constant negative rumination. And sort of dovetailing into that is, of course, traumatic stresses. So things like childhood abuse or natural disasters, which are significant type of stresses. So thinking about what happens when we are faced with a stressor, you'll see here, this is a very strange picture of a man skydiving that they've managed to make it look like they've opened up. And of course, he's choosing to induce stress and adrenaline, and all sorts of the stress hormones there. But stress really basically at the start is around kicking off the fight-flight response. So the fight-flight response is a massive part of this, and what you can see here, no doubt a lot of you are really familiar with this, the different things that we experience in our bodies when our fight, flight and freeze, which is often left out, response is initiated. So there were some things that I just found really interesting looking at this. I know for me, just reflecting, when things get really stressful and I've got far too much on my plate, I walk upstairs and the TV's on and it always sounds like it's blaring and there's noise, and then I notice the clutter. So I found it really interesting to look a bit deeper into this slide and see that, of course, our senses sharpen. So our hearing ability increases, which if you think about from a survival perspective is really necessary if you're in a situation where you need to be listening out for something really bad that could happen so that you can be prepared and run or fight. But if you've got a house full of kids and you've just walked in the door, of course, your body's in the fight-flight response because you're in chronic stress. So it's really interesting, and one that maybe not necessarily just any of the females listening will know, maybe some of the guys as well. Perhaps even that sense of not being able to tolerate mess or chaos or clutter. And there are a number of people, Marie Kondo would be one of them, that purport to the idea of having an uncluttered environment. Having a minimalist environment is good for reducing stress. So it's just really interesting, some of these things. So you can see the whole body kicks into action. And of course, it's with the purpose of moving all of those resources through to our major organs and our muscle groups so that we can either fight or we can run, we can flee. So just digging in a bit more into a really important system that drives this, that we should all know about if we work with people, is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. So it's sort of referred to as the stress response system because of the role that it has in turning on during stress to activate that fight-flight response, and then, of course, turning off to protect us from stress as well. So it basically helps to, get availability of glucose, like I was saying, moving the blood into the different muscles and those survival systems so we can run or fight. And it's interesting, cortisol generally gets a bit of a bad rep from what we know about it and how neurotoxic it can be and how harmful that it can be on certain parts of the body. But some people don't know that, in fact, in the short term, it's protective. It's actually there to protect us from inflammation. So it initially blocks it, which limits the detrimental effect that stress can have, and the inflammation that would result if cortisol didn't show up on the different multiple systems of our body. And it assists in the shutdown of the stress response via a negative loop, feedback loop, which is obviously, our parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system serve to, of course, either turn up or turn off the stress response. So we've got a lovely, like many of our systems in our neuroendocrine systems, we have a lovely system that should function well and work for us when we need it. But of course, it's never that simple, and things always go awry. So just going back to Selye, who was our endocrinologist in Canada, who was sort of considered one of the grandparents of stress, they started to look at 3 different stages of stress. So this is maybe really helpful for us to now start thinking about either ourselves or our family or people that we're working with. So firstly, we've got our alarm stage. So this is obviously in the initial fight-flight response, where our stress is kicked off. At this stage, if you look down the bottom there, the green line indicates that sort of level of homeostasis, or the normal state of resistance that we're in, where our body's attempting to sit and maintain. So in that alarm stage, we definitely see an increase in our sort of what we call our allostatic load, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. So if that stressor continues, we move into the resistance stage, where really we are mobilizing all of our resources to combat and try to maintain that high level of resistance to that stress. So our body's trying to maintain that homeostasis while we're attempting to deal with whatever that stressor is and often shut it down. And then we get our third stage, which is, where the problems really start and the wheels start falling off the cart, where people reach an exhaustion stage. And that's where that stress has continued and the body runs out of resources to cope and keep that stress system running. And so you start to see that resistance drop off and people begin to suffer. So when we're thinking about stress, we need to look at it in two ways. We have, of course, our acute stresses, which are often helpful stresses. They're reactive, adaptive, they're often motivating and necessary short-term responses to stressful stimuli. So this presentation was a good example of that. I realised that I had written a different presentation previously, so I didn't actually have a stress presentation to write, so I had to get myself together and I had to produce it in the last week or so. So obviously I needed that stress. If I didn't have enough of it, I wouldn't have gotten this done, and you'd be sitting listening to me drivel on about nothing. So I needed that bit of stress to hit that optimum level and crack on and get my work done. But if you can imagine, if I had social anxiety, for example, and I'd known about this talk 6 months ago, you can imagine that it would have induced perhaps more of a chronic stress. So I may have become a lot more stressed and for a lot longer, and perhaps to a much higher degree than I got. And if it was perhaps over 6 months before the presentation, then that type of stress moves me into exhaustion, and then of course potentially burnout or breakdown, or whatever words we want to use, where my health, my mental health, all sorts of things could have obviously really come undone. So acute stress isn't necessarily the problem. We need it in life. It's the chronic stress, obviously, that we're talking about here, the stress that goes on and doesn't abate. So just looking at some of those early studies that Selye did, and digging in a little bit deeper, he identified that acute physical and emotional stresses cause these pathologic changes in lab animals over time. So he did some nasty things to rats with all different types of stressors, and he's found that they started developing stomach ulcerations, things like their adrenal glands started to enlarge, etc., etc. And what happened as the stress became more chronic was he started to see various diseases that are often seen in human beings start to hike up in these animals. So things like rats, keeling over with heart attacks, having stroke, developing kidney disease, and even things like rheumatoid arthritis, which you'll note is obviously an inflammatory condition. So he really challenged the belief that was held at that time that individual conditions were caused by individual pathogens. So different bacteria, for example, that might cause TB, and there was a real sense that different diseases had their own individual pathways, and he really sort of pushed back on that and looked at the idea that there are lots of diseases that can be caused by different insults or in this case stresses, but that all lead to those similar roots of challenge that may present in different ways. Not only in animals, obviously, but in human beings as well. So this brings us back to our HPA axis, for those who've just joined, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. So when we look at a normal stress response on the left here, we can see that with the stressor, the hypothalamus kicks off, and then, of course, via the pituitary and different hormones and neurotransmitters, the adrenal glands are signaled to release cortisol, and that cortisol initially works at the immune cell level to block inflammation. Now, and of course we have our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system working, the feedback from the cortisol up the parasympathetic to actually help to turn that stress response off if the stressor has relieved, or we've worked out that there's not that much danger. So in chronic stress, we start to see the same thing happening, but over time you get quite chronically high levels of cortisol release. And what you can see there is that there becomes a problem in that blocking function of inflammation, and we can get what we call cortisol resistance at the immune cell level. So instead of those inflammatory immune cells sort of behaving as they're supposed to do, they can start to mobilize. And of course, we know that one in particular, cytokines, and I'm not an expert on this, but can actually move and cross into the blood-brain barrier and cause inflammation in there. So that sort of leads, and I do touch on this later on a little bit with the mental health side of this, to potentially initiating conditions like depression. And then in chronic stress and that continued cortisol resistance, of course, you get more and more immune cell activation, and we start to see real sort of brain damage. So we know, the studies around looking at the Romanian orphans, for example, there was evidence of actual atrophy of brains, and not just different parts of the brain, because we know when someone's stressed, we can start to see different parts of the brain really shut down in terms of their functioning, but actually reducing in size because of those toxic effects of that cortisol. Or actually the immune cells, because what's interesting is that actually cortisol doesn't stay high. We end up with low cortisol release at the end. So there are all sorts of challenges that can happen, and you can imagine just how much wear and tear this is now causing on the body. So you get that potential for overall immune dysfunction and the susceptibility for these autoimmune conditions to kick off, as well as all the other systems that can start to dysfunction. So talking to that, when we start to see what we'd call HPA axis dysregulation, so that system sort of starts to fail, it becomes overactive, and then it can become actually oversensitive, so it can be more easily kicked off and turned on with much smaller triggers as someone becomes more and more hypervigilant and looking out for more and more danger, is that people obviously begin to struggle with sleep. Most people don't sleep, some people oversleep, and that becomes a problem. We know that lack of sleep is hugely risky when it comes to disease processes. We can start to see the endocrine system kick off, blood pressure shifts with, often more than not, hypertension, immune system becomes lowered, people begin getting sick, blood sugar dysregulation, because of course that fight flight is helping us to enable more blood sugar, so we're pumping out more and more insulin, so we can start to see resistance there. Abdominal fat starts to move out as we start to stockpile that cognitive fuzz that people often get when they're stressed, because of that effect of stress and maybe some of that inflammation that's moving in. Fatigue, as they start to, their adrenal systems, and they're burning through all their B12s and their other B vitamins. Stress intolerance, where their systems really, and we go back to some of those sensory changes where they just really can't tolerate the same level of sensory and environmental stresses, whether it's children playing or music or whatever it might be, like I was saying before, that you become super sensitive, and actually you need much quieter. If you think of areas and less crowded places, and if we think about people, for example, that have post-traumatic stress disorder, we know that a lot of them really struggle in large, busy, noisy, crowded places. And again, if we think even about autism, which in that a lot of people with autism struggle with significant stress and anxiety, interestingly, they too struggle with sensory issues, which we know is linked to the condition as well, but perhaps exacerbated by stress. So irritability, people start craving foods, and their blood sugar levels are going up and down, and their brain is actually pushing them out to get more calories to stockpile in case there's, the stuff's going to go wrong. Blah, 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 blah. So as we go along, but the one thing I really wanted to point out, apart from obviously the mood changes and inflammatory conditions, is for women with changes, because obviously stress has a massive impact on the endocrine system, and it sort of starts really shifting the resources towards running the stress system. So those other hormonal systems and neuroendocrine systems begin faltering, because Peter's starting to pinch from Paul, because Paul's needing all these resources. So, one of the biggest things I see in my practice is women struggling with huge hormonal dysregulation. And interestingly, a lot of those women have very early stresses. So they have complex levels of trauma and long-term chronic stresses that are there. And you start to see massive problems with heavy bleeding and irregular periods, and, potentially things like development of endometriosis and other conditions. So it's just a really important one to look out for with women, because there's a lot we can do for those challenges by working with stress. So moving now and just thinking about stress, why is it that we can have stresses, and some of us can experience the same stress, but we can have very different reactions? And this is, of course, because stress is an incredibly subjective phenomenon. Perception is absolutely key. So I love this picture of this. I don't know if they're a family or what. If they are, we can see mum's sort of excited and scared. The big sister up the back is looking a little bit more petrified. Dad looks like he's absolutely loving it. He's really enjoying all the adrenaline and everything running through. He's a bit crazy with it, a bit unhinged. And the poor kid, who looks like they're far too small to even safely be on a roller coaster, looks like they're literally bricking it, potentially scarred for life in this. So basically, stress very much, and they often say it's not what happens to us, it's our perceptions of events in life. It is our perception of it and our sense of not just control, but future outcomes and all sorts of factors that relate to how bad we think things could get, how we see our own internal coping mechanisms and resources, who else might come to our aid, and how likely it is we think that things are going to happen. All these factors obviously result in having either lower levels of stress if we've got a nice flexible look at things and we're more hopeful and self-backing, or much higher levels of stress if we have quite a negative look on things, or if we're experiencing something that just is absolutely horrible. So I want to just touch on here the importance of early experiences, and really largely what we're talking about here is trauma. And I want to move from just, when we generally think about trauma, we think about abuse. Different types of abuse, whether it's emotional, physical, sexual, but I want to think about attachment trauma here, which is a term that I use to discuss real relational trauma and largely sort of rejection that children can experience from their significant attachment figures, where they're not available and they're unable to develop a secure attachment. And of course, that could be a whole nother session. So what's really interesting is that attachment actually molds that HPA axis and other important brain structures and functions in infancy, which creates different trajectories of vulnerability to stress, both physiologically and psychologically. And we know actually in utero, babies are listening or feeling, or they're tuning in, they're perceiving what the stress hormones and signals that mother is providing as they're in utero, to get a sense of what that environment is like that they're about to be born into. So that will, if we think about out there in animal species, that really helps to prime the animal to know perhaps how they need to act early on. And the same's thought to be true for humans. And of course, when they come out, when babies are born, and they are looking and reading what's happening with their parents or their significant others, it's really starting to form how their stress systems run, basically. So we can all blame our parents. I'm only kidding, to a point. So the hypothalamus converts affective experience, so emotions, basically, largely, and everything physiologically that comes with it, into physiology and biochemistry. So what we feel, of course, then absolutely impacts on the body. And we've actually been able to prove this by doing masses of data and studies on a whole huge sample size that was collected over a decade of almost 18,000 participants in the ACE study, or the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that happened in America. So they've been able to prove the lifetime risk trajectories of children that are subject to significant adversity in childhood. which of course no doubt arises from lots of pathways, which we're going to look at now. So the ACE study, if you don't know it, please familiarise yourself. I really do believe that you should not be working with people and not know about the ACE study, because it's incredibly informative to understanding why what people have been through has such a massive impact on where they are and where they're at risk of going. And if we don't understand those things, we can't interact and we can't provide care that potentially shifts some of those trajectories. So on the left here, the column, you can see the adverse childhood experiences category shows the different categories of adversity that kids experience and particularly experienced in this study. So everything from physical, emotional and sexual abuse to household environmental stresses such as parental substance abuse, divorce or separation, mental illness in the family, suicidal behaviours, violence, imprisonment or a loss of a parent through abandonment or going to prison, for example, or suicide, and then neglect. So kids being abandoned and physical needs or emotional needs being unmet. And I've got to say, having worked in primary care for a hell of a long time with what we term our worried well, emotional neglect to one degree or another on a continuum is incredibly common in human beings, and sometimes in really lovely families, but where mum or dad haven't been emotionally available for one reason or another, or have had the whole "you'll be right, just pick yourself up," and haven't been able to be there for young people. So I see that a lot. So with the impacts of these develops, of course, health behaviours to try and ease the pain and cope, as well as neurobiological effects. So things like emotional regulation problems, we start to see mental health symptoms coming out here, problems with sleep, memory dissociation, and then of course the health risk behaviours that come along with trying to manage and cope with not just what's happened in the past, but the re-experiencing of that as the young person grows up. So everything from obviously smoking, drug abuse, promiscuity, finding themselves in situations where those original traumas of childhood get repeated. So one that's really common is women that have been sexually abused who find themselves very sadly in situations where they experience sexual violence as adults, etc., or perpetrating interpersonal violence from others from obviously a fight response as part of their anxiety. And then from these, the long-term consequences of unaddressed trauma, and I really want to sort of highlight that trauma that people haven't had a chance to process, shift, change, and get some freedom from. So we see obviously higher rates of heart disease, cancers, poor self-rated health, sexual diseases, and then social problems, everything from people finding themselves in and out of the justice system, homelessness, intergenerational transmission of abuse, long-term use of health services with chronic conditions, for example. So there's lots of different sequence that we see from and trajectories that come from this. And this is the ACE pyramid, which is the conceptual framework that came out of that, where they were able to identify and speak to some of those scientific gaps around why it is that over a lifespan of someone with significant childhood adversity, we see these social, emotional, and cognitive impairments that can lead on to challenges with risky behaviours, lifestyle problems, disease, disability, social problems, and early death. And whenever I'm talking to the slide, I always speak about my experience of working with young men and women who are in gangs in South Auckland. And when you start to talk about their sense of their future, that it's not uncommon whatsoever for people to actually predict an early death. And of course, what we know in some of our gangs is that young people often don't particularly live that long, really, and that may be through violence or accidents, substance abuse, or things like the long-term effects, obviously, of heart disease or kidney disease, etc., etc. Now, I found this today, and I just wanted to really share it because I think it just sort of opens that ACE pyramid up even further, to look at initially digging deeper at trauma in social locations, so where people are actually sitting within our our population in the different spheres of socioeconomic or whatever sectors, whatever sort of groups we're looking at, that generational embodiment or that historical trauma that can happen right back. We know here in New Zealand that that's been huge, particularly for Māori, with the impacts of colonisation and the intergenerational trauma that's been experienced from that. The social conditions that surround and are directly related to that and the local context of that, and then the complex trauma and ACEs that children can experience really as a direct result. And what's been put in here is that impact on allostatic load, so that impact of constant stress on really disrupting the homeostasis of the body and starting to cause that chronic stress starting to cause major problems in all the systems, as well as the disrupted neurological development. And the adoption of health risk behaviours here has been termed coping, that people just try to cope. They're doing as well as they can with what they've got. And then, of course, up to, the disease and distress that can be experienced. But as well, this altered pyramid has got the risk of criminalisation and stigmatisation by society, and then of course leading to early death. So I sort of really love the way that has just been made so much more richer to have a good look at what the realities of many of our different societies and populations around the world. So looking here at this term allostasis, it's basically the process of maintaining homeostasis through the adaptive change in response to what's going on in terms of the stressors. So this is a nice little look at just how we've got our environmental stresses, what's happening around us, what major life events we're going through or we've been through, again, what that might include trauma or stress or abuse. And the really important thing here is around that not only do we have our individual differences with genes and experience and development, and of course our individual behavioural responses that are part of that fight-flight coping adaptive mechanisms, but it's we all have different perceptions of stress, how we see threat, our sense of helplessness perhaps, having a heightened sense of vigilance. And you can imagine that where we've come from and what we've experienced absolutely shapes those belief systems that drive those perceptions. And all of that having a major impact on the physiological stress response, so what is happening in the body, and how those physiological stress responses in the body can become really heavy in terms of an allostatic load. So that attempt to adapt and maintain our health becomes hugely compromised. This is just in another slide here, tying in, the health risk behaviours that come as a direct result of chronic stress, and the way in which those primary mediators of the neuroendocrine system creates those changes in the cardiovascular system, our metabolism, immune system, brain, to create that allostatic state that can lead to things like hypertension and obesity, increased infections, mental health conditions, and how those with the health risk behaviours. So it's interesting to look at those as separate things, that it's not just the direct effect of the health risk behaviours like physical inactivity or substance abuse, but also of what's happening in the neuroendocrine system, that dysregulation that can cause those health consequences where we get an allostatic overload. Premature aging, luckily the light doesn't show up my wrinkles. Whenever I look in the mirror, I think I look much older than I am, and oh my God, that's my stress. Through to the cognitive decline, and we know that stress is a major risk factor for things like Alzheimer's and early death as well, obviously being one of the most significant. So how does stress manifest in our behaviours? So we're just doing a little bit more digging in here to help us understand it, and we're looking at through some animal models again. I love this. Why? Yes, I am a bit stressed. Why do you ask? This is one of our lab mice. So what they saw when they looked at some studies around the behavioural shifts that animals have in the labs when they're exposed to different types of stresses, is that they either fall into the category of either being a fight response or a flight response. Freeze isn't really in there, but one is that there's that impaired response inhibition. So, and that's around. So if you've got obviously a response inhibition, then you're struggling to inhibit that response. So in one case, rats eating more and more and going back and back, which of course leads to problems with obesity and everything else that comes from that. A lack of motivation, so rats just not seeming to want to go out and be as active as they were, changes in social behaviour, social withdrawal and overall reduced interaction, sexual behaviours being impacted, and they see inhibited mating behaviours. Actually, I'm just looking here, the response inhibition should probably potentially be under eating as well. Aggressive behaviours, which is obviously more the fight response, and what they call anti-predator responses, which is very convoluted way of sort of saying conflict avoidance, or the flee response, running away. And this was a really interesting and quite a sad one, particularly if we think about New Zealand and the impacts of some of the significant stresses that a lot of our population are facing, and our high rates of child abuse and death through abuse in our country, and that these rats show a reduced parental behaviour when there's prolonged stress. And that's a direct result of impacts on some of those beautiful bonding, calming hormones like oxytocin and prolactin, all those things that actually help us to attach and bond to kids. So, if you think about one of the reasons we do skin-to-skin contact with mothers and now both parents, is we're wanting to really initiate oxytocin release in the child and the mother to promote that bonding and that early positive experience of attachment after birth. So it's really sad to see that they've been able to sort of in some ways prove through these animal studies that stress really impacts the sort of parent that you become and how you behave. And I'm sure a lot of us at the moment might be thinking about that with maybe some feelings of guilt or reflection who have kiddies. We're all on the boat together. So just looking now and going to our hot topic of COVID-19, and maybe some of the reasons some of you have tuned in, it's interesting around the world. We're continually monitoring what's happening in terms of mental health impacts of COVID-19 and other impacts, but we're definitely seeing challenges with people losing motivation, becoming demotivated as their stress levels increase, problems within the family unit in terms of that parenting, more substance abuse. We're doing some work alongside the Drug Foundation as a COVID response, and there's definitely been an increase in drinking to try and cope. Eating, I don't know about you guys, but I certainly have a COVID muffin that's developed that wasn't there before because of the increase in drinking and eating and the inactivity. I at times had a hoarse voice from yelling at my kids. And what we know around the world is there's definitely been an increase in domestic violence. And part of that obviously is because people have been stuck not being able to perhaps go out and spending more time with perpetrators of violence in the home, but also obviously those perpetrators have become a lot more stressed, and so a lot more stress intolerant and potentially a lot more volatile. So when we think of stress behavioural responses outside of significant natural disasters like COVID-19, I always lean to Dr. Libby Weaver, if anyone has heard of her, and her rushing woman syndrome. So this idea of, women that are juggling a million things and running around trying to do everything perfectly, so feeling completely overwhelmed and tapped out for time, overburdened, and starting to result to really just not putting any time aside for themselves whatsoever. So just constantly on the go, doing for everybody else. And obviously men definitely fall into this role as well, that aren't looking after their diets and are just grabbing quick bites, struggling with guilt because they're not getting the balance right, so they don't feel that they're doing enough or being enough, feeling stressed and irritated, struggling with their periods or their perimenopause or their menopause, struggling with sleep, feeling both wired and tired at the same time, and beginning to struggle within their relationships and their feelings of closeness. So stress is a massive thing, obviously not just for women, but for men, and stress is really starting to be identified as becoming quite a pandemic and a health risk itself. We talk about being depression as sort of the number one leading illness. I don't know if we've reached that yet, but I think actually if we peel back behind depression, stress is our biggest problem, and stress outranks depression any day of the week, really. So I just thought I'd touch really quickly on some interesting things that I think are quite correlated. This is just a graph of what's happening with obesity in different OECD countries. So we can see there particularly America, huge on obesity over there. There's a hugely obese population, as well as, we're seeing Australia also starting to spike up. England, we're fairly obese here in New Zealand as well. And another thing, and my screen's popped up, if we have a look, it's interesting that, of course, and it correlates that the number of people with diabetes are increasing, but rather than necessarily just linking here at the idea that this is all food related and diet related, we've got to look at diabetes and think about sort of, especially in some of the type 2, obviously, the inflammatory responses that might be going on. Then we have a look at our increase in mental health conditions around the world, and substance use disorders. So I think, my look on this is not just we're eating poorly, but we're living poorly and we're a hell of a lot more stressed. Whether we're more stressed than people were previously is hard to know and to answer. But yeah, we certainly, I think, are not coping with stress very well, and I think we're doing pretty well at creating stress for ourselves. So if we look at that in terms of just one condition, because we can't necessarily cover all of them, but with depression, we know that major depression can be caused or facilitated by chronic stress exposure. So it's definitely one of the identified causes, and that's been supported by findings that people that are depressed often have altered hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis functional dysregulation, as I call it, and increased corticotropin releasing hormone, which is of course what we release down to our adrenal glands to help us pump out cortisol, our stress hormone. So we can see stress in patients that are struggling with depression, and like I was saying before, it's now considered by many to be an inflammatory condition, and they're throwing around and whether it will take off, whether there's going to be any evidence garnered, but actually the idea of potentially looking at novel use of things like antidepressants for depression. One of the things though we know, and I'm going to talk to this in a second, is that actually a lot of the really effective treatments for depression, and we're talking about psychological treatments, we're talking about things like mindfulness or diet changes, nutritional approaches to depression, which are all garnering a lot of evidence, are all anti-inflammatory. So just touching very quickly on when we look at diet, and again we could do a whole sort of lecture on this, but is around understanding our microbiome and our gut. So obviously our microbiome is gaining more and more recognition for the amazing things that it does in our body and how diverse and amazing it is. Something I recently heard was we should have around about 150 different species of microbiota. And what we're actually seeing now is that over time, some of those species becoming extinct because of the impacts of stress and diet and toxins and all sorts of things actually killing off some of those species. And I don't necessarily quote me on this, but I heard one person in a presentation say that in some really quite overweight and unhealthy Americans they've studied and found 10 different species in the microbiome rather than 150. So, we're certainly looking to the gut as it potentially playing a major role in lots of different illnesses. So we now understand that the gut and the brain have an absolutely incredible relationship with each other, and the gut is now really integral for mental well-being. The gut has been identified as manufacturing about 80% of our tryptophan, which is tryptophan converts to serotonin, which obviously is our happy hormone. It's what we're targeting when we look at using antidepressant treatment, and serotonin converts into melatonin. So there's this bidirectional relationship between the gut and the brain via the spinal pathway and the vagus nerve. And if we think about what happens with the gut and how it's impacted by stress when that fight-flight response kicks off and the HPA axis sort of mobilizes everything to get us ready to survive, one of the big things that we experience is butterflies. Some people get diarrhea, and a whole bunch of different GI symptoms as their digestion is sort of turned off momentarily, because all of the resources are needing to go into those other areas of the body that we might need to run away or fight or whatever. So we do see a massive impact on the gut of stress, and they've shown in studies that prolonged stress, or even actually I heard in one talk 2 hours of stress can show shifts in the diversity of the microbiome and impact on the gut and the gut health. So our gut does not like stress. It really, really doesn't. And so if the microbiome and what's happening in gut function, which obviously part of the role of the gut is to absorb nutrients so that we can feed all our cells and rebuild them and build hormones and all sorts of things. If the gut is that important, then, we really need to be paying a lot more attention to it and what we put in there. So this is just thinking about food and what happens with how we're feeling. This is just showing the conversion or the biosynthesis of tryptophan into 5-HTP, which is serotonin. It will become serotonin, and the same with dopamine. So we know that these happen, these sort of conversions. But what often isn't talked about is what are the cofactors that are needed. And you can see in red here, we've got lots of really important nutritional cofactors that are required, different vitamins and minerals. So our diets become crucially important. So everything from zinc, vitamin C, magnesium, B6, iron. One of the big things that I always check when people are feeling quite depressed are their iron levels. And we do tend to allow people particularly in primary care and around, to have lower iron levels than probably would be optimal, really, for not just energy and physical health, but for mental health. And, I don't know if many people are really understanding the important role of iron and being able to convert that tryptophan into serotonin. I just on Tuesday saw someone with a ferritin level of 7 who's just become really depressed and anxious recently. And so, that's often, the first thing that we need to look at to try and treat. Because if we don't have those cofactors, if we've got a poor diet, if we've got poor nutritional absorption, then we're obviously going to really struggle to build our hormones. So this is just another example. And this model here sort of looks at what happens when we become depleted of serotonin and melatonin and the different conditions that we may well set ourselves up for. Everything from cravings, obviously problems with sleep, conditions like fibromyalgia, for example, or chronic pain conditions. So when we look at the cycle of stress, if we try to put all this together in order to try and sort of think about what can we do with people, we know that this definitely is a vicious cycle. Stress is a hugely vicious cycle. Stress requires a lot of fuel in terms of enacting our physiological, psychological, behavioural response, even our cognitive responses, our thinking responses. You know, rumination in the brain uses a lot of glucose up. So, you know, that stress has a major impact on the brain, which we've talked about. And of course, the more stressed we are, the more intolerant we are, the more the way of seeing things and thinking changes because of our stress. We start to make bad decisions, and there's our lifestyle challenges. We reach for the chocolate, we reach for the wine or the whiskey or whatever it might be. We go to sleep late because we're scrolling through Facebook, whatever it might be. And then, of course, we have to live with the consequences of our decisions. You know, which might be annoying and mildly problematic, but over time become hugely problematic. And of course, for some people, those bad decisions are life-changing. So I just wanted to talk really briefly. I don't know what my time is. I'm just going to have a quick look. Okay, I'm just about finished. At a case study to sort of try and wrap this up. So this was a 47-year-old CEO that I saw a couple of years ago, incredibly driven, very adrenaline seeking, high energy guy. He was getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to the gym. He couldn't stand the traffic in Auckland as well. He literally got up so early because he just could not tolerate the stress. He had a long history of stress, perfectionism, major problems with relationships, and low moods, and moods that went up and down. He ran 100 kilometres a week, trained every single day. This guy wanted abs. He was using fat strippers and all sorts of things to get ripped, as he called it. And he came along literally because his GP was just so worried about his high stress. This guy was having episodic periods of significant low moods with real suicidal ideation, and he called it wanting to hit a reset on everything, wanting to leave his marriage, his job, his family, all sorts of things. And he just couldn't sleep. So he tried to go to bed, but often at 1:30 he would wake up and he couldn't get back to sleep. He was absolutely wired. So he'd start working sometimes, always on the go, just didn't want to be unproductive, so never sat down, hadn't taken annual leave in 3 years, all sorts of things, just couldn't tolerate noise. This guy was chewing 60 pieces of habitual gum every single day. He was a moderate to high drinker, a bottle of wine most nights, ate very little because, of course, he wanted to be skinny so that he had abs, and was just pulsing through coffee and caffeine drinks constantly. And he never felt content in life, he was saying to me. He wanted to experience this stress. So I was thinking, what's going on here? Has he got high testosterone? Is this stimulants? Has he got problems with not absorbing nutrients because of all the coffee or the nicotine, or his poor diet, high stress, lack of serotonin, maybe high dopamine or low dopamine, or some sort of neurotransmitter balance? And of course, he wasn't sleeping. So we looked at doing some testing, and I never got to see the results of these because what I'll tell you in a second. But anyway, we looked at obviously inflammatory markers, zinc, B12, cortisol, all sorts of things. But basically I said to this guy, look, if you want to feel better, you've got to get rid of these things that are overstimulating you and causing you more stress, including the gum. We need to reduce alcohol, which isn't helping you at the levels at all, and reduce your exercise and protect your sleep. I prescribed melatonin, which was the only medication that I used at that point. And I chucked him on a really good zinc complex to support his stress system, and put him on a basic micronutrient formula, which you can buy here in New Zealand, B Pure 1. To really try and address any of the other deficiencies that there might be, in quite a scattergun sort of a way, but a way that I hoped might be helpful. So he came back 6 weeks later, and he was absolutely did everything perfectly. He was quite a perfectionist, so thank God he applied it to following what I said. And everything was different. He was sleeping and able to sleep and waking up at 8 o'clock feeling refreshed. He was amazed at the improvements in his energy, his clarity of thinking, how he felt overall. His tolerance of stress and other people and noise and traffic improved dramatically. He was prioritising a long holiday away. His wife and his family just saw a huge improvement, and he was feeling happy and content for the first time in a number of years. And the cool thing was that a couple of years afterwards, someone bumped into me, told me about this guy's husband who just went to see this nurse practitioner who put him on these nutrients and got him to do all these lifestyle changes, and he's still so happy, and they're touting all these nutrients, and it was awesome because it was him. So he'd maintained everything. He'd maintained all the lifestyle changes, and he'd maintained all the benefits. He hadn't moved back into that cycle. So look, the important things that we have to do for people is, firstly, we've got to identify their people's stresses, and we've got to make a plan. And this isn't just identifying the sort of secondary stresses that are around them at the time. I'm talking about getting to the initial source of that stress, the driving stresses. And I'm big on trauma screening. If people have histories of trauma and we don't ask, we can't get them effective help to really work on that major initial stress that may well actually be driving a lot of their other stresses that they're seeing, whether it's relationship distress, family stress, lifestyle stresses, whatever it might be. Work out what can be changed now with ease and what needs extra resources or support, and obviously the things that can't be changed, but make a plan, and obviously biting off what we can target first, and getting some quick wins, and really getting the person motivated, because what we're talking about here is a number of different behavioural changes. Encourage the person to look at regular self-check-ins. So we need to start being able to monitor where our stress levels are, identify those indications that we are entering into a stress mode before we start to burn out, and knowing then when we need to intervene and what we need to do. The thing that I try to work with everyone I see is be kind, be kind, be kind. And I do support Labour. This isn't about the Jacinda push here, although she's well into kindness. What I'm talking about largely here, which is really the only way we can truly be kind to others, is self-compassion. Our internal stresses of self-criticism and self-doubt and all of those factors are one of our biggest stresses, and they're one of the things that we can do the most about. So self-compassion is a huge antidote to stress. Because of course as well it helps all of our de-stressing things to be much easier to do. Psychological support, so important, to be able to talk to someone, to be able to understand what's going on and what's driving in those vicious cycles. So whether it's face-to-face therapy or counselling, pastoral support from a religious leader or whoever it might be, online therapy, which is massive now, a lot of it's free. You just need to point patients towards it. And Just a Thought, as I said, is a really good one. John Kuhlman's got a fantastic tool, Mentor Me. I've got a whole bunch of stuff available at the moment. Build an exercise. Exercise is really proven to help. Activities that calm down the HPA axis system, things like even just warm water, yoga, saunas, peaceful music, all those things, meditation, mindfulness, and ensure realistic expectations when trying to work with stress, because it's a marathon, not a sprint. We're literally, for a lot of people that have chronic stress over a long time, we're helping to shift their neural wiring. So we need people to keep doing things and going back to them. Diet is a major protective factor, and they've done studies with mice where they've introduced significant toxins like BPA, but they've supplemented. You can see the mouse on the right was supplemented with nutrients, with methyl-rich foods that protected their. These are actually the babies of mothers. So the brown mouse, their mother was supplemented with things like folate, for example, which obviously we give to mothers to protect against neural tube defects, and the other one wasn't. So things like food can be fantastic to protecting us from the impacts of stress. Our Western diets are horrendous for causing stress, and we know that improvements in mood and whole foods can actually not just reduce the risk of depression for people that have high processed foods, but a reduction in the development as well. So and treatment. So there's all sorts of evidence around that. I'm flicking through because I've taken a lot more time than I thought I would. Exercise is another one that's massively helpful for depression. Moderate exercise for older adults, 30 minutes walking, jogging at 70% max heart rate for 3 times a week has been shown to be really protective against things like depression and an effective treatment. And again, just being aware of what we're pointing people towards in terms of healthy eating. There are new ways that we now look at the food pyramid, and the Harvard School of Public Health have got a beautiful new food pyramid that we need to get our heads around so that we know what foods we're pushing people towards. And you can see at the bottom of the right pyramid there, they've included exercise and activity on that pyramid as well, which is great. I won't talk too much about this, but psychological flexibility, which obviously comes from things like engaging in psychological interventions or online tools or all sorts of things, is amazing. It's a key ingredient to psychological well-being and protecting us against stress by helping us to be able to adapt to changing demands, move our mental resources around, so shift our thinking, shift our seeing, our way of seeing things. Balancing our life and our needs, and improving our self-control. So when we have better psychological flexibility, we can not only see things differently, but of course all of these things help us to rebound from stressful events and find ways of coping that work with that flexibility. The blue zone is, I've got some beautiful suggestions. The blue zone is basically a whole bunch of regions around the world where people live a long time and they're very healthy. Dan Buetten has been behind some of this. And so they really push for a pyramid around moving naturally. You know, exercise is right up the top, having the right outlook, and a purpose, eating wisely, and having a sense of belonging and connection, which obviously we haven't really covered here. So look, I have run over. I really do apologise by 10 minutes. I've thrown a whole lot of information at you. I can see there are 4 questions. Most people haven't left. My God, you've done well to stick with me. So I now want to hand over to Kathy and maybe have a look at some of these questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Anna. You're amazing. You're just oozing with enthusiasm. It's fantastic. We need more of you. So yeah, you're right. There's 4 questions. So first one up we've got is, what subsidised supplements can be used?
Okay. So that's a tricky thing because the supplements that we know, if we're talking about nutritional supplements, I don't actually know of that many that are subsidised, and if they are, they're often subsidised for certain types of health conditions or problems that most of our patients wouldn't meet. I do know that WINS, and I spoke to and I don't know his name off the top of my head, but he's a GP who's sort of the medical head of the Ministry of Social Development, did say that if there was good rationale for someone who perhaps was on a benefit to receive nutritional supplements, then that sometimes they are able to pay for those, obviously not necessarily in every circumstance, but yeah, we really haven't got to the point where pharmac are looking at nutrition as a viable way to support stress and different health conditions and protect people against the impacts of stress. So it does mean that we have this limited access for people that are on sort of lower incomes, which is a huge challenge. Aside from some of the nutrients that you can utilize, like obviously things like B12 or folate or other, I think vitamin D you can prescribe. But yeah, all of, for example, those testings, again, apart from B12, vitamin D, most people have to pay for unless they've got specific conditions. So we're not fantastically ahead in really focusing on identifying nutritional deficiencies and supporting people as a treatment, unfortunately.
Thank you. And then we've got, in your experience, do you think people who struggle with depression and have a past high-level sports career, that this is due to chronic stress from years of high-level physical performance?
Two thoughts on that. One, potentially, but perhaps more so if they've become quite nutritionally depleted and they haven't built up those reserves, because obviously we know that excessive exercise becomes a significant problem in itself. So that is absolutely possible, but the other side of the coin is that we know that people that get involved in things like ultra marathons or do anything to the extreme can sometimes be quite perfectionistic. So we can't necessarily assume that it's around the actual impacts of the exercise themselves on moods. Although it might be that if they've stopped exercising and that was an incredible way to bolster their moods and they really needed that, that they can get low. It may well be around sort of personality and high expectations and perfectionism. I've worked with a number of people that drive themselves significantly, and you've got to sort of assess for that and look at sort of beliefs and impacts of what it's like now, not perhaps being in the life that they were in, and the impacts of maybe some of the life change they've experienced.
Okay, and they've got, what are the specific long-term effects you're seeing within primary health care from emotional neglect of the child and how this is managed?
So everything from psychological impacts with, I see, especially older generations with that real sort of stiff upper lip that were raised by, parents in the sort of 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s, where they have very low self-esteem and they might be very high self-sacrifices or whatever it might be to make up, and high levels of chronic stress that come from that, of sort of trying to manage keeping up a bit of a front while trying to function as a human being. So lots of psychological challenges that can come up, and these often are the people we call sort of the worried well, right through to obviously challenges around being in abusive relationships, to the extreme ends of emotional abuse, people that have huge social problems or physical health problems. So I think those ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, are, we don't put enough focus on them, but they really are quite huge.
Thank you. And then just a brief answer on this one. Any tips on dealing with suicidal people presenting acutely?
Oh, that's a whole different
presentation. It is a big one, so I'm saying just a quick,
yeah. Look, I would say one is to get really good at doing an assessment of if there's actual intent. If there is, of course, the only thing that you really can do is get that person significant help, whether it's ringing 111 or getting a crisis team involved or whatever it might be, to try and save their life in that moment if there is an intent to suicide. If it's just ideation, I think it really is around just sitting and listening, doing a lot of validating. That in itself can be really significant for people in terms of feeling heard and connecting with someone else, and then sort of trying to work on what are some of the protective factors and what does the person need to look after their distress. Suicide really is a behaviour response to feeling totally disconnected, totally overwhelmed and hopeless and distressed, and I think shifting people onto identifying what are they feeling and what do they need in that moment to try and look after their own distress, and how can you help them or anyone else can really start to help the person to see that maybe they won't always feel that way, and bring about some hope that may mean that they go and get some help and things change. So hopefully that was helpful.
Fantastic, thank you. And so I know that the recordings are going to be made available within the next few days, and people will be able to access them at mobilehealth.co.nz/webinars. But there's also somebody's asked if you're willing to share hard copies of your slides.
Absolutely. Some of my stuff is really well referenced, and others I've just picked out and pulled up, but I'm really, really happy for my slides to go out there. If anyone has any questions around where I've gotten some of my information from, I'm really happy for people to get in contact, and I can try and pull that out for them.
Thank you. And so you've had people from all over New Zealand. There's someone from the Cook Islands as well as logged in tonight. I saw one. I saw one comment that somebody said they said, I didn't think I was going to enjoy this webinar, but I absolutely loved it. Thank you.
Oh, that's
Isn't
really
that the
good to
coolest thing ever?
Well, it's funny because I haven't been able to see anyone, but I can feel you all on the other end of the screen, and I really wish you all a fantastic night, and good on you for doing the work that you do. Keep it up.
Oh, and thank you. No, the great session, saying they've learned a lot, really enjoyed it, where you presented it, taking new information away. Yeah, really, really positive feedback coming through in the comments from people. Thank you.